I arrived in New York in early October. The city was loud, multi-layered, like an old playlist, where each song was from a different life. I stayed with an acquaintance in Brooklyn, in a room without windows. The first few days felt like a dream. Coffee shops with names I couldn't pronounce, people talking quickly, as if time was a currency to be spent without regret. I walked around the city, looking at the signs, at the faces, at the rhythm. And I felt something inside me tighten. Not fear. Comparison. On the subway, I saw people who looked like they knew where they were going. In coffee shops, those who ordered oat milk lattes without pausing. In parks, those who ran with headphones on as if their bodies were a project. I looked at them and thought, I'm not like that. And this "not like that" sounded like a sentence. I started keeping a diary. I wrote, "Today I didn't have time. Today I didn't know how to answer. Today I compared again." These weren't notes but confessions. Because every day felt like a test I didn't pass. One evening I went to an immigrant meeting. In a library, which smelled of paper and a little loneliness. There were people from different countries: Iran, Colombia, China. We sat in a circle, and each one told why they had come. I listened and compared again. Someone had a Harvard degree. Someone already worked at Google. Someone volunteered for 3 organizations. When it was my turn, I said, I just wanted to be in silence. And it sounded strange. Not as a goal but as an escape. After the meeting I would go home and think, maybe I have nothing to be proud of. And this thought was like a rock in your pocket. You carry it and it pulls you down, but you don't know how to get rid of it. The next day I met Julia. We agreed to meet in Central Park. She brought tea in a thermos, and we sat on the grass. I told her about the meeting, about the comparison, about the rock. She listened for a long time, silently. And then she said, "What if your life is not for comparison, but for living?" This phrase didn't change me instantly. But it stayed. Like a seed that hasn't sprouted yet, but already is. I came home and opened my diary. I wrote, I don't know who I am here. But I know that I want to be honest. And it was the first time I didn't write about others. Only about myself. I woke up at 8 o'clock, because that's what all the immigrant guides advised. Keep up the routine, be productive, don't lose your pace. I made coffee, opened my laptop and started looking for a job. Hundreds of vacancies, dozens of platforms, endless resumes. And each one was an attempt to prove that I was worthy. That I was no worse. That I could do it too. I wrote about myself. Organized, responsible, quickly adaptable. But it wasn't true. I didn't adapt. I was lost in terms, didn't understand how LinkedIn worked, and didn't know what a cover letter was. I just tried to look like the people I saw on the subway, with laptops, with coffee, with confidence. I failed my first interview. They asked me, "What makes you stand out?" And I remained silent. Because everything I wanted to say, "I know how to listen to myself," seemed inappropriate. I wasn't startup-oriented, didn't have a growth mindset, and didn't know how to sell myself. After that, I didn't leave the house for 3 days. I watched videos of other immigrants who told how they found a job, bought a car, and started a new life in a month. And every video was like a blow. Because I wasn't like that. I couldn't be like that. I wrote to Julia. "I don't think I have time." She replied, "Where are you in a hurry?" This question hung in the air. I didn't know where. I just wanted to be like everyone else. But who was this everyone? One day I went to the park. I was just walking without a goal. And I saw a man sitting on a bench with a notebook. He was writing something slowly, attentively. I sat down next to him at a distance. And we were silent. After a few minutes he asked, "Do you write too?" He nodded. And he said, "I write down what I feel every day. Because it's easy to lose yourself here." We talked for about 20 minutes. He was from Brazil, worked in a kitchen, and every night he wrote about things he hadn't said out loud. That meeting was like a pause. Not a breakthrough, not a decision. Just a pause. I went home and opened Google Docs. I wrote, "I don't know who I want to be." But I know who I don't want to be. And that was the first time I didn't compare. I just listened to myself. The next day, I deleted half of my resume. Kept what was true. I know how to create a space where people feel at ease. That didn't sound like a career advantage. But it was mine. I didn't get an answer. But for the first time I didn't feel ashamed. Because it wasn't a failure. It was a step towards myself. I started going out more often. Not because it got easier. But because the silence in the room started to sound like an accusation. I signed up for a free course called Creative Writing for ESL Speakers at my local library. There were 10 people there, from Vietnam, Peru, Poland. We wrote short pieces of English, read them out loud, and tried not to blush. My first piece was about a coffee shop, where I sat alone and listened to the barista say, "Next." I wrote, "That word sounds like a command, like a reminder to move. And I don't want to." My voice shook as I read. But no one laughed. On the contrary, one woman from Peru said, "That's very accurate. I don't want to be next either." After class we went for tea. We sat in a small cafe, where tea was served in glass cups, and the music was so quiet that it was almost non-existent. Someone talked about their work, someone about their children, someone about how hard it was to find a place to live. I listened and compared again. Someone already had stability. Someone had documents. Someone had confidence. I was silent, and I thought, I don't have any of that. But then I remembered Yulia's words. What if your life is not for comparison, but for living? And something in me relaxed a little. The next week I met a guy named Alex. He was from Ukraine, had lived here for 5 years, worked in the design field. We sat in the park, ate bagels, and he told me how hard it was at the beginning. I used to compare myself to everyone too. Especially Americans. They're so collected. And then I realized they just know how to pretend. That phrase stuck with me. Because I really thought everyone around me was confident, successful, and adaptable. And I wasn't. But what if it was just a facade? I started to notice little things. How people on the subway look at their phones, but their eyes are empty. How the barista smiles, but their voice is tired. How my roommate says I'm good, but then goes silent for hours. And I thought, maybe we're all just trying. Not to be better, but to survive. I wrote in my journal. Today I didn't compare. I just was. It was the first time. Without evaluation. Without competition. I started to notice myself. My reactions. My pauses. My desires. And it was like a return. Not to success, but to myself. I knew that Saturday was the day of calls. Mom always wrote, "Maybe we can talk?" And I always hesitated. Because these conversations weren't just about, "How are you?" They were about, "What have you done?" I would answer, "Everything is fine." But this fine was like armor. Because behind it was hidden. I haven't found a job yet. I don't know what I want yet. I haven't had time yet. One day she said, "Did you see how Sasha has already bought a car from us? And he's renting an apartment." I was silent. 'Cause what can I say? That I just managed to leave the house today. That I learned not to be afraid of the subway. These comparisons were like needles. Not because Sasha is bad, but because they were measuring me. As if I were a project that needed to be evaluated. I wrote to Yulia. "It seems to me that I have not met expectations again." She replied, "Did you ever promise to be Sasha?" It was simple, but true. I began to think about how often we become mirrors for others. We are watched, and they see not us but our own expectations. And if we don't reflect success, we are considered broken. I decided to write a letter. Not to my mother. To myself. "Valentine, you don't have to be an example. You don't have to be fast. You don't have to be clear. You have the right to be a process." I didn't show this letter to anyone. But it was like an internal contract. The next Saturday I spoke to my mother again. She asked, "So, how are you?" I said, "I'm learning to live slowly." She was silent. And then she said, "The main thing is that you feel good. It wasn't a complete acceptance. But it wasn't pressure anymore. I realized. Comparison is the language of fear. People are afraid that we won't fit in. That we won't make it. That we won't justify. But I didn't want to justify anymore. I wanted to be. I was sitting in a coffee shop on the Lower East Side, where the tables were made of worn wood and the music sounded like something between jazz and rain. In front of me was a laptop, a blank document, and the thought, what if I create something of my own? Not a business. Not a startup. I called it Tish. Not like a brand, but like breathing. I created an Instagram page without a face, without slogans. Just words. Short, honest, slow. You don't have to be fast. Your silence is not a defeat. You have the right to be different. I didn't expect a reaction. But it did. People wrote. This is like a breath of fresh air. I thought I was the only one who felt this way. Thank you for not forcing me to be better. I realized we're all tired of comparisons. Of we need more. We need to be faster. We need to be like them. And we're all looking for a place where we can just be. I started writing every day. Not for algorithms, but for myself. One day I got a message from a girl in Texas. I work in an office where everyone is competing. I open your page. And remember that I don't have to be first. It was like confirmation. Not that I'm successful, but that I'm alive. I started meeting people who also wanted slowness. We sat in parks, drank tea, talked about how we didn't have time. And it wasn't weakness, but freedom. I wrote in my diary. I created a space where there was no need to compare. And I became a part of it. It wasn't a decision. It was a continuation. I no longer wanted to be like someone. I wanted to be with someone. In silence. In truth. In myself. I woke up at 9:12. No alarm clock. No shame. Just woke up. In the kitchen, silence, a kettle, and light falling on the table as if nothing had been asked for. I made tea, sat down, and didn't answer the phone. I sat. It was an ordinary day. But something about it was different. I didn't think I had to make it. I didn't think I had to prove. I didn't think I had to be like. Just was. Yulia wrote. How are you? I answered. Warm. And she said, that's the best answer. We met in the park. We sat on the grass, talking about not wanting to go back to our old rhythms. She said, I don't want to be the best version of myself anymore. I just want to be. And I answered, me too. We were silent. And this silence was like a language. Without comparisons. Without competition. Without how are they. I began to notice how my inner language had changed. Before I thought, I'm not there yet. Now, I'm here. Before, I'm not like them. Now, I'm like me. Before, I need to catch up. Now, I don't need to rush. I started writing a new series for Tish. Not about success, but about presence. You don't have to be clear. You don't have to be fast. You don't have to be someone else. These words came easily, because I no longer wrote from comparison. I wrote from myself. One night I was sitting on a rooftop, looking out at the city lights, and I thought, I didn't win. I didn't lose. I just stopped playing. And that wasn't defeat. It was freedom.